Okay, so remember on Schoology, all the review material stuff, if you just click on the link for the with the little folder, it takes you, this is where you turn your final in on the day of finals, and then here's the slides. And then what I decided to do was, previously I've been typing up the notes in the Google Slides, but instead I started putting them in a Google Doc because it's just easier. I'm not sure why I was doing it the other way to begin with. This is a video from Block D. It's very short. We had just started to review, but it goes over the notion of social sin and kind of the format of the final. And then this is the review session with Block A, and we kind of started with the first 3 prompts and then went from there. And what I'm going to do with you guys is actually start in the reverse order so we could focus on 3 and 5 and then go to those other prompts. And I also thought it might be helpful to think about how to write an introduction for your paper. So you'll have both those. These videos are already linked here. And then after class, I'll put the video of this session here. In case there's if you're like an auditory learner and you want to hear the audio, you can hear it. Okay, so let's see. So in the slides, I had all the questions in the slides, but then I just decided to make this document. So if we go, here it is. Okay. So in the last classes, I started with this prompt. So it's questions 1, 2, and 4, and they're essentially like the same. So there's a lot of notes here for this already, and I'll circle back to this at the end. But what I wanted to do was actually start with the other 2 prompt possibilities to kind of flush those out a little bit more. So prompts, I'm going to start here and then we'll go back. So prompt 5 says, discuss the view of hardship and suffering and their relationship to human happiness as presented in A Christmas Carol. So one way to approach this question is to ask yourself, who's truly happy in the film? And so, and we'll look at some of those examples down here, or maybe I could just, maybe I'll add this down here. How do I want to do this? Well, that's one way of looking at it. But I guess the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is happiness? One thing we can say is, and this might be good for an introduction. So you have to have an introduction to your essay. So if we ask ourselves, what's the purpose of this paper? Basically, you're doing a moral analysis of A Christmas Carol. And the structure of your analysis is going to be contingent upon the question you get, right? And the goal here is to apply the relevant terms that from each unit that would apply to your question. But in introducing your paper, remember Unit 1 was that introduction where we did what is ethics, what is morality, and we studied the secular ethical systems. So that might be a good place to actually address some of that Unit 1 stuff that is kind of not really relevant to the rest of the essay. So the point of your essay is to be a moral analysis of A Christmas Carol. So in an introduction, you might want to define morality or ethics. So you could say something like ethics provides a systematic a systematic set of principles to guide people to live moral lives. You could maybe briefly compare Catholic moral thought to the secular systems. So something you might say to bring in some of that Unit 1 vocabulary is you might say that, like some ethical systems like utilitarianism are based on consequences. So on consequences, the ends justify the means, and you can CF stands for compare. You could compare that to Catholic ethics. Remember, Catholic ethics, since we operate out of an Aristotelian framework, Catholic ethics is teleological. And remember, the telos is the goal or aim of a given thing. And telos is grounded in our nature. And so Catholic ethics seeks to know what is good for human beings based on our nature. And you could also add that it's based on principles. So a principle is, a principle is a basic, basic truth or proposition. Basic truth or proposition that provides the basis for a system of thought or behavior or a chain of logic. And so Catholic ethics is based on principles. So we have universal principles that we can apply to concrete examples. And that's basically what your essay is going to do. You're going to take all the principles you've learned and apply them to a Christmas Carol. So an example of a principle is like the dignity and value of human life. And that's like the grounding principle of all Catholic ethical thought. So those are just some ideas of how you might start an introduction. Does that make sense? I hadn't gone over this with other classes, and I thought, well, maybe that might be helpful. You don't have to spend a ton of time on the introduction, but I thought that might be helpful. So in looking at the issue of hardship, suffering, and happiness, you would want to define happiness, and happiness is ultimately grounded in our human nature. And we learned, hang on, that's not what I wanted. I'm trying to clean up some of this messiness. No, oh, whatever. So, remember, yeah. What we're looking at in this question, it will relate to other questions as well. Yeah. And you'll see some of the stuff we're doing now repeated in the other notes. But if we're looking at happiness, happiness is grounded in our human nature. In eudaimonia, that was that Greek word, and it means flourishing. And that was actually from Unit 1, and it would also be in Unit 2. And it's a Greek word, and it gets translated as happiness, but it means to flourish. Let me space after paragraph. It means to flourish or be like fully alive according to your nature. To be fully alive according to your nature. So it means to be for a cat to be like the best cat. Like the best cat. To have perfect catness. So that's what in Catholic moral thought, that's what morality is about. It's about asking, like, how do I be the best human being I can be? And then you get into, like, the hierarchy of goods and all that. But we also looked at the levels of happiness, right? So remember, level 1 was pleasure, and that's seeking pleasurable experiences like consumerism, good food, exercise. And the problem with level 1 happiness is it's short term. For example, the pleasure from eating cake. It also leads to, this should probably be a semicolon. It also leads to that, like, grasping and wanting more. Yeah. Okay. 2:15. Do you want me to call the office? Or do you want to just leave and check in when you go out? Yeah, you could do that. If our happiness is only coming from level 1, listen, then it leads to wanting more, and we're ultimately unfulfilled. One thing that I pointed out, I put this quote here from Hillel Belloc. One thing to remember about both the hierarchy of goods and the levels of happiness, the levels of happiness is like a hierarchy of goods as well. Is we're not saying that level one things are like bad. What we're saying is if all of your sense of identity and focus and the way you're spending your time is only on level 1, then you're ultimately going to lead a very unfulfilled life. But as Catholics, we're not Puritans. So this is a famous quote from Hillel Belloc. He says, "Wherever the Catholic sun does shine, there's always laughter and good red wine." There's a sense that, we should enjoy the level 1 pleasures, but we don't want them to kind of like take over our lives. With Scrooge, what we notice, an example from the film, is he suffers from the vice of insensitivity, so he can't actually enjoy level 1 pleasures, which is very strange because it's highly unusual. Most people have no problem enjoying level 1 pleasures. Most of us actually sometimes get stuck enjoying them too much. Another example of a level 1 pleasure done really well was Fred's Party, or remember Fezziwig? They have virtue enjoying level 1 pleasures, and that's the virtue of temperance. So they're examples of how you can experience like level 1 pleasures in a way that's good and healthy, because they don't go overboard, they don't spend too much money, like that. Level 2 was achievement. So this is like the ego comparative level, being better than others, or always like being better than yourself, like PRing in your track races and stuff. It's more satisfying than level 1, but it can lead to jealousy and insecurity. And we see this in Scrooge. He's a strange character. He doesn't acquire wealth for the pleasure of like spending it. That's usually why we acquire wealth with level 1. Rather, he like acquires it for the sake of having it. And when he was talking with his fiance, he mentions that he was too worried about money to like get married, and he loses the chance. So he lost the chance for a family, which basically means he's gonna be alone. And have little access to level 3 happiness, because level 3 happiness is all about contributing beyond yourself. And if you don't, that's one of the main ways we do that is within families. And if you don't have a family, it's really hard to live for somebody else. You still can, like priests and nuns do that all the time, but Scrooge isn't like a priest or a nun either. Level 3 was the contributive level. It's giving. You give of yourself for others. It's living for something greater than yourself. So it doesn't necessarily. It could be like people who are nurses, doctors, teachers. Like nobody's a teacher because it's good for us. It's not. It's all for you guys. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So examples of that from the film. Remember the philanthropists? Their names were Poole and Hacking. They told Scrooge those who have the means to provide. Those who have the means should provide for the poor. So their goal was to provide. They were trying to provide a good Christmas for the poor people in the workhouses. And with level 3, we noticed that Scrooge wasn't happy with hoarding the apparent good of wealth. I have the apparent goods up further in the notes, and I'll show you that in a bit. But wealth is also one of the apparent goods. So it's a good, but since it's not an ultimate good, it's not, it won't bring you eudaimonia. So, he's not happy hoarding his wealth. He only becomes happy, when he shares it. Let's see. It's gotta go like that. Shares it with others. And so that's like, it's that's how he finally gains happiness. Level 4, is the transcendent level. It's being in relationship with God. In other words, serving perfect truth, beauty, justice, goodness, and love. And the Cratchits, Cratchits, I think that's how you spell it. The Cratchits, one of the things that we noticed is the Cratchits are people of faith. There's some evidence to support that would be they go to church. They pray. They read the Bible. So we know that faith is like a part of their life. So when Tim dies, the family is able to remain happy because they have hope in their faith, and they also have the love they share between their family members. Yeah. So what this shows us is when you have let's see. So hang on, Tim dies. And remember, Bob Cratchit said, after they were talking about Tim, he says, "I am a happy man." And so we have to ask the question, well, how can you be happy when your child just died? The answer to this question is it shows that when you have higher levels of happiness, you can overcome and endure suffering. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to be involved in activities that would connect you with higher order goods, right? Yeah. Another example of level 4 was Tiny Tim. He talks to God a lot and talks about God a lot. He seems to be deeply connected with his faith. And if you ask the question, who is the happy in the film? Tim and the Cratchits he was like the happiest person in the film, but he kind of had the worst situation. He's sick. He's disabled. You saw him, like, he wanted to sled with the other kids and couldn't, but he took joy in their joy. And so Tim is able, despite his suffering, to remain happy because, again, he's kind of tapped into something that's far bigger than himself. remember when they were like saying Christmas dinner, he has that kind of cute little classic line where he says, God bless us. God bless us, everyone, or something like that. This shows that he has gratitude. That's one of the virtues, right? And because he has the virtue of gratitude, despite his suffering, Tim is able to maintain a level of happiness that most of us, it's super countercultural. Countercultural. It's very like Christ-like in a sense. Yeah, it's very Christ-like. Yeah. So if we ask, what the poor family is kind of interesting. So we saw Scrooge was confronted with that poor family, right? And somebody in the last class had mentioned that they have great suffering, but they want to stay together. Oh shoot! Hang on, with my mother. I gotta start something. Hey, Mom, I'm teaching. I just gotta tell you something real quick, okay? I have to proctor a final after school, so I'll be late. Yeah. Okay. Bye. Yeah. I'm like 42, and if I'm late, she still yells at me. It's like really annoying. It's like, why are you late? It's like really sad. You'd think like you're like being a teenager is hard because you're trying to become an adult, and your parents still want to keep you like their little girl. But it like doesn't get easier when you get older. It's such a bummer. So the poor family, they have great suffering, but they want to stay together. And one thing we could add to this that we didn't talk about in the other class was the idea that with level 1, you don't want to be a slave, like a slave. A slave to level 1, and that's why we need virtue. Virtue helps with this. However, another thing, recognize my word. Oh well, I'll fix it later. Another thing we can recognize though is, I don't know if you guys have ever learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We can also recognize that you do need to have basic needs met to have a basic sense of well-being. So people do need to have basic needs met. And we can ask about the moral obligation to love neighbor. And so one of the things that came up and I think it was in block A, it was either Sydney or Nora was reflecting on the idea of truth, that Scrooge wants to remain ignorant so he doesn't have to face responsibility for his part in creating the structures of sin that lead to the suffering of the poor family. He also, it's because he doesn't want to feel guilty. That way he can kind of remain ignorant and it's not his problem. And that's what we call vincible ignorance. So, let me add that here. Vincible ignorance. And that's a Unit 3 concept. Vincible ignorance is when we could inform our conscience, but we choose not to. And if you're vincibly ignorant, that means you're morally responsible for any sins you commit. So Scrooge can't claim that I just didn't know and get off the hook. So there's a sense in which the finally learning the truth is what changes Scrooge and allows him to practice the virtues that can kind of change the situations of the poor family. Like Scrooge has the power, let's add that there. Scrooge has the power to change the circumstances of the poor family. And it's only when the ghosts show him the truth that his conscience is free to choose the good of others, and that leads to greater happiness for himself and others. And it's like happiness is kind of like contagious. So those are some ideas of how you could tackle prompt number 5. And there, you might come up with something completely different. The goal is just make sure you address any applicable concepts from each of the units. If we get this one, off the top of my head, I don't remember which one I gave your class. So that's prompt 5. Let's go down. So prompt, and then we're going to go back to the other ones. Prompt 3, discuss the notion of human responsibility for the less fortunate as depicted in A Christmas Carol. So there's going to be some overlap with what we just talked about, right? So first of all, responsibility is grounded in our human nature. That's like from Unit 2 and Unit 3. And I guess we could say, we could define what is a nature. I don't have that here. A nature is the essential defining characteristics of a given thing. It makes it this rather than that. So what is human nature? Let's see. Human nature, it means that we have, we're both a body, and we have the powers of the body, which include the vegetative powers. We also have our emotions and our desires or appetites. And then we also, plus the body, we have the soul. And your soul has powers. The powers of the soul are intellect, and that's your ability to know and reason. And that's your conscience is also a power of your intellect. It's a specific application of your intellect. And then you have the power of your will. And your will is your ability to make free choices. Okay. So, because you have free will, that's what makes us responsible for our actions, right? So, like, if my cat kills a sparrow, I don't punish her because she doesn't choose to kill the sparrow. It's her nature to kill birds and lizards and stuff. Sorry. On the other hand, there's a chat message from my Amazon delivery driver. What the hell does that mean? Sorry, guys. I've never seen such a thing before. So I cursed. Sorry. What was I saying? Oh, so, but if my daughter were like to kill a sparrow without some good reason, like it's trying to peck her eyes out or something, she would be morally wrong because there's no good reason to hurt a defenseless creature unless like it's pecking her eyes out or something. So, freedom is our ability to act or not act, and it's grounded in our free will. And so, if we look at the idea of responsibility for the less fortunate in the film, one of the principles of Catholic morality is to love thy neighbor. So in your introduction, you could talk about, again, the idea that Catholic ethics is a principle-based system. So one of the principles is that we should love our neighbor. We get that teaching from Jesus. It's also just part of the natural law. So we can ask the question, does Scrooge take responsibility to love his neighbor? And we would say, at least at first, no. He says the poor should go to the workhouses. He also says, I pay my taxes. So let me separate this out. He says the poor should go to the workhouses despite the fact that they're basically prisons for the poor. You could also, oh yeah, go ahead. You might want to bring up if you could say that they violate St. Thomas Aquinas. Remember his definition of a law? It has to be, a law is an ordinance. It's an ordinance of reason promulgated by one in authority for the common good. And yeah. Okay. You might remember to ask it though. So if you wanted to, you could apply, and this is Unit 3, right? So it's promulgated by one in authority for the common good, and the law here was the new poor laws of, I want to say 1833, and we would say that this is not reasonable. And it's not reasonable. It also is not for the common good. They intended it to be, but it doesn't. It's not for the common good because it has a detrimental effect on the poor. And it's not reasonable because remember, they don't get paid. So once you're in the poorhouse, you can't get out of the poorhouse. When Scrooge talks about the workhouses, he fails to acknowledge the truth of how unjust they are. So we could add that he fails to acknowledge the true nature of the workhouse system. And you can mention that this is a social sin. And again, anytime you're referencing truth, that's like a Unit 1 concept. He says, I pay my taxes. So when he says that, he's trying to, that's a way of him, when he says that, Scrooge is trying to rationalize his sins of omission and not take responsibility for his role in creating the unjust social systems of the time. And one of the ways he did that was his business practices knowingly hurt the poor. Remember when he goes to the stock exchange, the he comes and he's like, well, I'm going to raise the price of corn. And they're like, you can't do that. It's going to hurt the poor. And he's like, you keep talking, I'll raise it again. And they're like, fine, we'll pay it. But Scrooge is not taking responsibility for his role as a businessman for creating these unjust social structures that perpetuate the whole workhouse system. And then finally he says, let them die then and decrease the surplus population. So obviously that's just like totally vile and crass. And this shows, it shows the depravity of Scrooge's character. And you wonder, gosh, can this guy change? And he does. So with this question, so again, looking at human responsibility for the less fortunate, on the positive, we had the philanthropists. Remember in Unit 4, we looked at the parts of the moral act. You could look at the philanthropists as an example of people taking responsibility to love thy neighbor. And you could actually, you know what you could do? You know what would be interesting? What if you, I'll fix that later. So what if you look at the scene, what if you did this? If you look at the scene and analyze the moral act of the philanthropists, and you compared that with the moral act of Scrooge. So the philanthropists, you could compare the moral act of the philanthropist with the moral act of Scrooge. And how much time do we have? 10 minutes. Do you guys want to do that? Yeah? All right. Let's pay attention here. I'm trying to help you guys. What if we did comparing responsibility? So what if we compared, let's put a chart in here, insert table. So what if we looked at the philanthropist? That wasn't even close. And we look at Scrooge. So remember when we're looking at the moral act, who remembers, what do we identify first? Anybody remember the word? The object, right? So the object is what are we doing? So what did the philanthropist do? Anybody remember? That was pool and hacking. They went to ask Scrooge for money, right? So they're raising money, for the people in the workhouse. Yeah. And they said that they wanted to provide them with some Christmas cheer. So they wanted to provide them with some Christmas cheer. Then what do we look at? The intentions, right? So their intentions are to ease the suffering of the poor at Christmas time. And the circumstance was that the workhouses were an unjust social system. The poor in the workhouse have no provisions for Christmas. And the philanthropists say that they have the means, so they should provide for others. So we can see that they're taking a proper understanding of human responsibility. Let's compare that with Scrooge. So for Scrooge, the moral object here would be a sin of omission. It's not what he does, it's what he doesn't do. He refuses to provide for the poor. What's his intention? I guess his intention is to, I don't know. That's going to be the consequence. So his intention, I guess, is just to keep his money for himself. He has this whole attitude that like the poor are lazy. Like, it's like, I worked for this. And it's like, well, the people in workhouses don't even get paid, dude. And then the circumstance is he has a lot of money. The people in the workhouse have no ability to earn their own money. So it's not like they're lazy. Scrooge seems to like imply that the poor people are somehow bad moral character. Like he's somehow better than them. To earn money. And as Juliana was saying, the end result is, because remember, the consequences are part of the circumstances. The end result is he's going to make Christmas worse for the poor, and for himself. I mean, he's going to suffer for it as well. So you could in doing this moral analysis, that's unit 3. So the moral analysis here, that was unit 4. So if you're like, oh, I don't have anything from unit 4, if you start doing that, you're doing a unit 4 skill. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we also have here, in the other class, someone had mentioned how the ghost of Christmas Present convicts Scrooge's conscience. The ghost shows him that Timmy is the surplus population that Scrooge said should die. And it puts a human face on the problem of poverty. So that's what kind of melts Scrooge's heart. So helps melt Scrooge's heart. Remember in Unit 1, I thought about this when I was working outside with the leaves. Remember in Unit 1, the Samaritan woman? And the theme there was encounter. Let me grab the thing for that. I have it here somewhere. Remember that idea of encounter, and we talked about how Pope Francis talks about encounter, and Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman at the well and sees her dignity. The spirits, basically the ghosts, help Scrooge to encounter the poor in a Jesus-like kind of Pope Francis-y way, so that he is like, when the ghosts take him to see the poor family, when the ghosts take him to see the Cratchits, he's able to encounter them and see their humanity and their dignity. And he saw like ignorance and want. And so Scrooge is able to encounter them and see their dignity. And that's what makes him see his human responsibility. We also in one class mentioned the idea of Scrooge is like Cain when Cain denies responsibility for murdering his brother. Remember, God says like, hey dude, where's your brother? And Cain's like, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? And God's like, heck yeah, you are. So Scrooge is like kind of like convicted like Cain is, in a sense, if you remember that from freshman year. Again, in the issue of social sin. I also put this little poem here from John Donne, the idea that no man is an island. That's kind of what Scrooge learns. And so let's go back up to the beginning. Yeah. Yeah. Yep, that's what you're saying. Yeah, so you're gonna sit down and kind of, as you're preparing, look at these notes and think to yourself, okay, if I was gonna answer this question, which of the vocabulary do I want to apply? So every person could be using different stuff. It kind of just depends on the examples you use from the film and how you're going to tie those with the vocabulary and the concepts you've learned. So and that's kind of the challenge, right? So you need like one example, at least one example from the film, and like at least one concept or vocabulary word per paragraph, and you need like one per unit. Yeah. Actually, let me show you an example here that will help. So with these questions, these all go together because they're asking the same question like 3 different ways. So explore the ways in which the character of Scrooge changes over the course of the film. A Christmas Carol shows goodness and love defeating self-interest. Discuss this statement. A Christmas Carol has been described as a tale of moral redemption. Discuss this statement. Basically, the strategy for answering this question, either one, all 3 of those is essentially the same. So you're going to kind of show how was Scrooge before and how does he change. So, for example, one of the things you could say about him before was he's selfish. So how do you prove he's selfish? For example, he raises the price of corn. He says it's just business. He's like making excuses for behavior he knows is wrong. And these are terms you could bring into play. Unit 3, we learned about the conscience as a judgment of reason by which we know the moral quality of an act we're going to perform, are performing, or have performed. So the fact that he's rationalizing his behavior shows that Scrooge is using his conscience. He's just doing a really poor job of it. Because you don't have to say it's just business if you're doing the right thing. That would be an example of vincible ignorance. Also, in Unit 1, we talked about the truth. Truth is when what we know in our intellect is in accord with reality. And so, like, deep down inside, Scrooge knows it's not just business. What he's doing is wrong. You could bring in the idea that this is a social sin because Scrooge's unjust business practice of artificially raising the price of corn is an example of social sin because he's setting up a social structure that is prohibitive to the poor. So that's one example of before. You only need one, okay? But there are others. You could talk about refusing to give to philanthropy. You could talk about how he wouldn't buy coal to heat the office. Or you could talk about how he was lonely and isolated. He wouldn't go to Christmas dinner with his nephew. He also didn't support Marley when he was dying. He lives all alone. You could also talk about how he was like a deeply unhappy person. And each one of these, you would apply different ideas. Like if you're talking about his selfishness, you could talk about like sin of omission and conscience. If you're talking about his loneliness, that's where you would bring in the idea of human nature means that we have to be in relationship. And there's more notes on that below. Or you could talk about how he's unhappy and bring in the idea of the role happiness plays in kind of Scrooge's character development. And there's notes on this here. So that's all before. So if you're doing this one, either focus on he's selfish, focus on he's lonely, or focus on how he's unhappy. And then the next part is to show what happens after. So after, you could talk about how he went from loneliness to being in relationship. So the example of that could be when he went and started hanging out with Fred and his wife. And Fred and his wife talked about how that made them happy. And so Scrooge found happiness in relationship for himself, but also makes others happy. You could talk about how he went from a person of vice to a person of virtue. There's the definition of virtue. Here's some of the vices from before, some of the virtues from before. Or if you focused on selfishness, you could talk about how he goes from being selfish to sharing his wealth. And there's an example of the immoral analysis. So let me just finish one thought. So in this example for these questions, you're not gonna, if you're answering like this question, you're not gonna talk about selfishness, happiness, and loneliness. You just focus on one idea. Happiness, or focus on how he went from being unhappy to being happy, or talk about how he went from being selfish to unselfish, or how he went from being lonely to being in relationship. Only focus on one, and what you'll do is you'll focus on the vocabulary that's relevant to that topic. Does that make sense? So if you're talking about selfishness, you don't really have to talk about happiness, because that's not really, although, I mean, you could, you can make it relevant. But like with the selfishness thing, you talk about kind of his sins of omission, his poor choice of use of conscience. On the other hand, if you're talking about, you could talk about from being a man of vice to virtue. So in that case, you'd be using examples specifically of different virtues and vices. You might not talk about happiness or relationship quite as much. It just depends on the focus. So the challenge is to be able to make a decision about what vocabulary and topics are applicable to whatever examples you choose from the film, and you're kind of marrying them together, and you're taking, like, you have all this knowledge, you know all about conscience, you know about how to judge a moral action, you know about the principles of Catholic ethics, and you're going to take all this knowledge you have and apply it to this moral analysis of A Christmas Carol. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Because it's probably going to be, so, because what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to pick, like, if you think of a paragraph, each paragraph is going to have its own sort of topic. So you want to pick a topic that's specific, and you want to fully describe it, rather than just, you could do like a litany of things in one paragraph too. That's another strategy. But I think it's better to be focused and to have, what do they call it? Depth over, to go more in depth than have a bunch of stuff. I forget the expression. Yeah. So, that's part of the challenge, and it's a challenge it's not just a challenge in terms of like your knowledge of theology. That's where your knowledge of how to write is important, because you have to learn how to write across the curriculum, right? Yeah.
For all of our notes, you want them to be on the study guide, right? With all like the
If you lost it, you could just do it on paper.
Okay.
But what I would do tonight, and I also recorded block A, where we go in more detail over these first questions. So you can watch that first part of that one. But tonight, or whenever you're going to study, look at, you basically have 3 things you're preparing for, and kind of decide what parts of the film did you find interesting? And so what would you want to talk about given the prompt? And how can you apply your knowledge of Catholic moral theology to the film? So you guys might come up with examples that we haven't even discussed in class. You might see something in the film that I totally didn't see, that we didn't bring up, and that's fine as well. And you can come in with notes. So when you're using a vocabulary word, you should define it. You don't have to use like every word. And that's another thing that's challenging, is you have to pick the best topics and vocab given the question you're answering. Yeah. Well, you can use this. This is like 4 pages, right? Yeah, because that way you can highlight what words you want to use. Because you're not going to use all of these. Like, if you're talking about, like, happiness, you might not talk about a lot of this stuff, right? You just have to pick the stuff that's applicable to what question you're answering. Yeah.
So, like, for example, in your first, like, body paragraph, right? And they're, like, not so broad paragraphs, but say, like, you answer the main question and use an example from the film to, like, answer your question. And then you have to tie in somehow, like, a concept that
You have to have at least one. If there are others that are relevant, you can also include those, but only include things that are relevant. Don't feel like you have to include everything. I would prefer you to focus on key concepts and examples from the film and fully describe them over giving like a bunch of little things. Yeah, listing stuff. Yeah. And do we have time to write a paragraph together? Do we? 5 minutes? All right, let's try it. So let's try this. So, if we're answering, explore the ways in which the character of Ebenezer Scrooge changes over the course of the film. So, if that's what we're writing about, and we're going to do a body paragraph, let's do this. Yeah, you get 2 choices. All right, so let's do this together. So, if your question is, explore the ways in which the character of Ebenezer Scrooge changes over the course of the film, you'll write an introduction, and if you have your first, body paragraph, you're going to want to start with some type of topic sentence. So, if you have a topic sentence, you're going to want to start with how he was before. So you might start with, in the beginning of the film, Scrooge is a selfish man who makes poor use of his conscience. I'm just kind of making this up as I go. Who makes poor use of his conscience. An example of this is when the philanthropists ask Scrooge for a donation for the poor in the workhouses. For the poor in workhouses. In reply, Scrooge denies his responsibility to love his neighbor. He says that the poor can go to the workhouse. Hang on. Go to the workhouse. He also says he pays. He also says he pays taxes. Which is a way to rationalize his responsibility for the poor. Okay. So finally, when the men tell him how bad the workhouse is, he says, quote, then let them die. What was it? Let them die and decrease the surplus population. All right, so if anybody wants to So conscience is our ability to judge moral actions, and then talk about like the conscience. Does that make sense? See how it goes? Yeah. You're welcome. Hi.
Hello. I'm here to my phone.
Okay.